So we're given the reaction of nitrogen gas plus hydrogen gas to form ammonia. And we want to know, is the reaction spontaneous at 298 Kelvin? So the predictor of spontaneity is the free energy. If the free energy is negative, it's spontaneous. If the free energy is positive, it's not spontaneous. And so I can use the information that I'm given to calculate the free energy using the equation delta G is equal to delta H minus the temperature times delta S. And I've done that on the next slide. So we have our equation again. I've plugged in the enthalpy, the temperature, and the entropy. I just had to be careful because the enthalpy is in kilojoules and the entropy is in joules. I need to be working in the same units. So I've chosen to convert the entropy from joules per Kelvin to kilojoules per Kelvin. So to go from joules to kilojoules, I just divide by 1,000. And the free energy that we get at 298 Kelvin is negative 32.7 kilojoules. So delta G is less than 0. So the reaction is spontaneous. All right, the second part of the question wants to know above what temperature is the reaction no longer spontaneous. So we know that this reaction is spontaneous at low temperatures and not at high temperatures, because if I consider low temperatures where I set T is equal to 0, then the only thing I need to consider is the enthalpy, because the enthalpy is negative at low temperatures. The free energy is negative and it will be spontaneous. However, the entropy term at high temperature, so instead of being at 298, if I imagine I'm at infinite temperature, I've got a negative times a negative, so the entropy term is going to be positive, so at very high temperatures the reaction will not be spontaneous. If I want to know the temperature that the reaction goes from being spontaneous to not being spontaneous, well, if it's spontaneous, it's negative delta G. If it's not spontaneous, it's positive delta G. So it must be 0 in between. So in order to determine at what temperature the reaction is no longer spontaneous, I just plug in 0 for delta G, plug in my enthalpy and entropy values, and solve for that temperature. I've done that on the next slide. So I've set the free energy to 0. I plug in my enthalpy and entropy values. I solve for T, and I find that above a temperature of 463 Kelvin is when the reaction is no longer spontaneous.